The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at the tall windows of his private study, watching the ancient oak trees sway gently in the autumn breeze. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, showing a man who had waited decades to wear the crown and now faced one of the most difficult decisions of his reign. The weight of centuries of royal tradition pressed upon his shoulders, yet he knew that some traditions needed to evolve, even if it meant making choices that would shake the very foundation of the monarchy. Charles had been king for just over 2 years, but the shadows of past controversies continued to follow his family. The Jeffrey Epstein scandal had cast a long, dark cloud over the royal household, and Prince Andrew's association with the disgraced financier had become an embarrassment that threatened to undermine the monarchy's carefully maintained reputation. Despite stepping back from public duties in 2019, Andrew continued to live comfortably at Royal Lodge, the grand mansion on the Windsor estate that had been his home for over 20 years. The 30-room Georgian mansion, with its perfectly manicured gardens and historic significance, had become a symbol of privilege that many believed Andrew no longer deserved. The public's anger had not diminished with time. If anything, it had grown stronger as more details emerged about the extent of Andrew's relationship with Epstein. Every photograph of the Duke of York at Royal Lodge, every story about his continued residence there, served as a painful reminder of the scandal that had rocked the royal family. Charles remembered the countless family meetings, the heated discussions behind closed doors, and the advice from his most trusted counselors. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had protected Andrew during her lifetime, allowing him to maintain his residence and his dignity even as his reputation crumbled. But Charles was a different kind of monarch, one who understood that the survival of the monarchy depended on its ability to adapt to changing times and public sentiment. The king's private secretary knocked softly before entering the study. Sir Clive Alderton carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from decades of royal service. But even he seemed unusually tense this morning. The silver-haired man approached the king's desk with measured steps, carrying a folder that contained the final recommendations from the royal household's senior advisors. "Your Majesty," Alderton began, his voice carefully neutral, "the committee has completed their review. They unanimously recommend that the Duke of York be asked to vacate Royal Lodge within 6 months." He paused, allowing the gravity of the decision to settle in the room. The public relations damage continues to mount, and recent polling shows that 68% of the British public believe the Duke should not be permitted to continue living on the royal estate. Charles turned from the window, his face showing the strain of the past months of deliberation. He had hoped that time would heal the wounds, that the public would eventually move past their anger toward his younger brother. But the opposite had proven true. Every charitable event, every public appearance by other members of the royal family was overshadowed by questions about Andrew's continued presence at Royal Lodge. The financial burden had also become impossible to ignore. Royal Lodge required significant upkeep, from maintenance of the historic building to the extensive security arrangements necessary for a member of the royal family. The annual costs ran well into the millions, money that came from the sovereign grant and ultimately from the British taxpayers. In an era of economic uncertainty, when ordinary families struggled with rising costs of living, the optics of maintaining such extravagant accommodations for a disgraced prince had become untenable. "What are the legal implications?" Charles asked, settling into his chair behind the massive mahogany desk that had served generations of monarchs. The desk was covered with red leather dispatch boxes, each containing matters of state that required the king's attention. But nothing felt as weighty as this family decision. Alderton opened his folder and withdrew several documents. The Duke holds a 75-year lease on Royal Lodge, which he signed in 2003. However, the lease includes clauses that allow the Crown Estate to terminate the agreement under certain circumstances, including situations that bring the royal family into disrepute. He adjusted his glasses and continued, "Our legal advisors believe we have sufficient grounds to invoke these clauses, though the Duke would certainly have the right to challenge such action in court." The thought of a legal battle between the Crown and Prince Andrew filled Charles with dread. The media would have a field day with such proceedings, turning what should be a private family matter into a public spectacle. Yet he also understood that decisive action was sometimes necessary to preserve the greater good of the monarchy. Charles thought about his brother, remembering the young naval officer who had served with distinction during the Falklands War. Andrew had been a helicopter pilot, flying dangerous missions and earning the respect of his fellow servicemen. That Andrew seemed like a different person from the man who now lived in self-imposed exile at Royal Lodge, avoiding public appearances and spending his days in the shadow of scandal. The transformation had been gradual but devastating. Andrew's divorce from Sarah Ferguson in 1996 had been the first crack in his public image, followed by years of questionable business associations and increasingly poor judgment in his personal relationships. The friendship with Jeffrey Epstein had been the final blow, destroying whatever remained of his reputation and making his continued presence in the royal family untenable. "Has anyone spoken to the Duke about this possibility?" Charles inquired, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Andrew had become increasingly isolated, surrounded by a small circle of advisors who seemed more interested in protecting his remaining privileges than helping him navigate his way back to respectability. "The Duke has been resistant to any discussions about relocating," Alderton admitted. "He considers Royal Lodge his home and believes he has done nothing that warrants such drastic action. His legal team has indicated they would fight any attempt to force him from the property." Charles sighed deeply, feeling the weight of family loyalty pulling against his duties as king. Andrew was his brother, someone he had known and loved his entire life. They had shared childhood memories, family holidays, and the unique experience of growing up in the royal fishbowl. Yet he was also the sovereign, responsible for protecting the monarchy's reputation and ensuring its survival for future generations. The king rose from his chair and walked to a portrait of his mother that hung on the study wall. Queen Elizabeth II gazed back at him with the steady, calm expression that had guided her through decades of royal crises. She had faced her own family scandals, from her sister Margaret's tumultuous love life to Charles's own divorce from Princess Diana. Yet she had always managed to weather these storms while maintaining the monarchy's essential dignity. But this was different. The Epstein scandal had global ramifications, touching on issues of child exploitation and abuse that went far beyond typical royal family drama. The public's reaction had been visceral and unforgiving, reflecting a broader cultural shift in how such matters were viewed. What might have been quietly managed and eventually forgotten in previous generations had become a permanent stain that threatened to spread to the entire royal family. Charles remembered the difficult conversations he had been forced to have with his own children about their uncle's situation. Prince William, as heir to the throne, had been particularly vocal about the need for decisive action. The future king understood perhaps better than anyone how Andrew's continued presence at Royal Lodge undermined the monarchy's moral authority and threatened the institution's future. "Schedule a meeting with the Duke," Charles finally said, his voice carrying the authority that came with the crown. "I will speak with him personally about this matter. He deserves to hear this decision from me directly, not through intermediaries or legal documents." Alderton nodded, making notes in his leather-bound diary. "When would your Majesty prefer to meet with the Duke?" "As soon as possible," Charles replied. "This matter has gone on long enough. The monarchy cannot continue to be held hostage by past mistakes, no matter how personally painful it may be to address them." The private secretary gathered his papers and prepared to leave, but Charles stopped him with a raised hand. "Clive, I want you to understand something. This decision brings me no joy. Andrew is my brother, and I love him despite his failures. But I'm also the king, and I must put the needs of the monarchy and the British people above my personal feelings." "Of course, Your Majesty," Alderton replied. "The decision shows the strength of your leadership and your commitment to the principles that have sustained the monarchy for centuries." After his private secretary left, Charles remained alone in his study, surrounded by the symbols of royal power and responsibility. The sovereign's orb sat in a place of honor on a nearby shelf, its gold surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through the windows. It served as a reminder of the sacred trust that had been placed in his hands and the oath he had taken to serve his people with honor and integrity. The king understood that asking Andrew to leave Royal Lodge would be seen by many as the final chapter in his brother's fall from grace. It would effectively end any hope of Andrew's eventual rehabilitation and return to public life. Yet Charles also recognized that some actions carried consequences that could not be undone, and that protecting the monarchy sometimes required making painful personal sacrifices. As he prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of his life, Charles reflected on the irony of his situation. He had waited decades to become king, often wondering what kind of monarch he would be and what challenges he would face. Never had he imagined that one of his first major decisions would involve exiling his own brother from the royal estate. The autumn sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the Windsor grounds where Andrew had lived for over 2 decades. Soon, those shadows would be cast by someone else, as the Duke of York faced the consequences of choices that had forever changed his life and threatened the future of the royal family he had been born to serve. The grand drawing room at Royal Lodge had witnessed countless conversations over the decades, but none quite like the one that would take place on this gray October afternoon. Prince Andrew stood before the towering windows that overlooked the carefully maintained gardens, his hands clasped behind his back as he waited for his brother's arrival. The 30-room mansion had been his sanctuary for more than 20 years, a place where he could retreat from the increasingly hostile outside world and maintain some semblance of the dignity that had once been his birthright. Andrew had received a request for a private meeting with unusual formality, delivered by a royal messenger rather than through the typical family channels. The tone of the message had left little doubt about the serious nature of the discussion to come. He had spent the morning walking through the rooms that held so many memories, from the library where he had read bedtime stories to his daughters to the study where he had once planned his return to public life. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the afternoon silence, followed by the measured footsteps of security personnel taking their positions around the property. Andrew straightened his shoulders and adjusted his tie, a gesture born from decades of military training and royal protocol. Despite the circumstances that had brought him to this moment, he remained a prince of the realm, and he would conduct himself accordingly. King Charles entered the drawing room accompanied only by his private secretary, who quickly withdrew after ensuring both men were comfortable. The brothers had not spoken privately in several months, their relationship strained by the mounting pressure surrounding Andrew's continued residence at Royal Lodge. Charles looked older than his years, the weight of the crown evident in the deep lines around his eyes and the careful way he carried himself. "Andrew," Charles began, his voice carrying both authority and genuine sadness, "I think we both know why I'm here today." "I have an idea," Andrew replied, moving away from the window to face his brother directly. "Though I had hoped we might find another solution, one that wouldn't require such drastic measures." His voice remained steady, but those who knew him well would have detected the underlying tension that had become his constant companion since the Epstein scandal erupted. Charles settled into one of the antique chairs that furnished the room, gesturing for Andrew to do the same. The informal seating arrangement was a deliberate choice, an attempt to maintain some semblance of family warmth in what would inevitably be a painful conversation. Yet both men understood that this meeting was as much about royal business as it was about family relationships. "The situation has become untenable," Charles continued, his words measured and careful. "The public reaction continues to intensify rather than diminish, and the royal household can no longer justify the expense and security arrangements required to maintain your residence here." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. "The advisors are unanimous in their recommendation that you vacate Royal Lodge within the next 6 months." Andrew had been expecting this moment for weeks, yet hearing the words spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. Royal Lodge was more than just a home. It was a symbol of his status within the royal family and his connection to the institution that had defined his entire life. The thought of leaving felt like a final admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the scandal had cost him everything he had once taken for granted. "And if I refuse?" Andrew asked, though he already knew the answer. His lease on Royal Lodge included provisions that allowed the Crown Estate to terminate the agreement under extraordinary circumstances, and his legal advisors had warned him that fighting such action would likely prove futile and publicly embarrassing. "Then, we will be forced to invoke the termination clauses in your lease agreement," Charles replied with obvious reluctance. "Neither of us wants this matter to become a legal battle played out in the media. Such proceedings would serve no one's interests, least of all the monarchy's." The king leaned forward in his chair, his expression softening slightly as he continued. "Andrew, you are my brother, and I love you. Nothing that has happened changes that fundamental truth. But I am also the sovereign, and I have responsibilities that extend far beyond our family relationships. The monarchy must survive and thrive for future generations, and that sometimes requires making difficult decisions about the present." Andrew rose from his chair and walked back to the window, staring out at the grounds that had been his private kingdom for so many years. The gardens were entering their autumn transformation, with leaves turning brilliant shades of gold and red before falling to the ground below. The metaphor was not lost on him. Like those leaves, he too was experiencing a final, beautiful moment before an inevitable fall. "I understand the position you're in," Andrew said without turning around. "I've always understood it, even when I hoped that loyalty and family bonds might outweigh public opinion and political considerations." His voice carried a note of bitterness that reflected years of feeling increasingly isolated within his own family. The Duke of York had watched from the sidelines as other members of the royal family navigated their own scandals and controversies, often emerging with their reputations intact and their positions secure. His situation was different, he knew, both in its scope and in its implications for the monarchy's moral standing. The Jeffrey Epstein connection had touched on issues that went to the heart of public trust in the royal institution. "Where am I supposed to go?" Andrew asked, finally turning back to face his brother. "My entire life has been defined by my role in this family, by my service to the crown. Without this place that has been my home for 2 decades, what am I?" Charles felt the pain in his brother's question, remembering their shared childhood and the young man Andrew had once been. The decorated war veteran who had risked his life for his country seemed like a different person from the isolated figure who now stood before him, stripped of his military honors and facing exile from the only world he had ever known. "You will always be my brother," Charles replied gently. "You will always be the father of Beatrice and Eugenie, and they love you unconditionally regardless of public opinion or media coverage. Your value as a human being is not determined by your residence or your official role within the monarchy." Yet both men understood that Andrew's identity had been so thoroughly intertwined with his royal status that separating the two would be extraordinarily difficult. He had never worked outside the royal system, never developed an independent career or identity that could sustain him through this transition. The prospect of rebuilding his life at the age of 63 under the constant scrutiny of a hostile media seemed almost insurmountable. "The girls have been discussing this possibility," Andrew admitted, referring to his daughters Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. "They've offered to help me find alternative accommodations, perhaps something smaller, but still suitable for someone of my background." The phrase "someone of my background" carried multiple meanings, acknowledging both his royal heritage and his current circumstances. Charles nodded approvingly. "Your daughters are remarkable young women, and their support will be crucial during this transition. They understand the necessity of this decision, even as they sympathize with the personal cost it represents." The conversation that followed dealt with practical matters: the timeline for Andrew's departure, the arrangements for his personal belongings and staff, and the ongoing security considerations that would follow him to his new residence. Each detail served as another reminder that his life was changing irrevocably that the privileges and protections he had enjoyed as a working member of the royal family were coming to an end. Charles also addressed the financial implications of Andrew's departure from Royal Lodge. The Duke would no longer have access to the sovereign grant that had helped maintain his lifestyle, though the king assured him that the family would ensure he had sufficient resources to live comfortably, if more modestly than he had become accustomed to. "There is one more matter we must discuss," Charles said as their conversation neared its end. "Your departure from Royal Lodge will inevitably generate significant media attention. It would be best for everyone if this could be presented as your own decision, a choice made in the best interests of the monarchy rather than a forced exile." Andrew understood the political necessity of maintaining this fiction, even as it required him to accept public responsibility for a decision that had been made without his input or consent. The alternative would be a media narrative focused on family conflict and royal discord, which would serve no one's interests and might damage the monarchy even further. "I will consider how best to handle the public announcement," Andrew replied, his voice carefully neutral. "My solicitors can work with the royal communications team to ensure the messaging serves everyone's interests." As the meeting concluded, both brothers stood and faced each other across the drawing room where they had shared so many conversations over the years. The formality of their current interaction stood in stark contrast to their childhood relationship, when they had simply been two boys playing in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, unaware of the responsibilities and burdens that would one day define their adult lives. "I want you to know that this decision brings me no satisfaction," Charles said as they prepared to part. "I would have preferred to find another solution, one that allowed you to maintain your dignity while addressing the legitimate concerns about your continued residence here." "I know," Andrew replied simply, "and I want you to know that I understand the impossible position you've been placed in. The monarchy must come first, even when that means sacrificing individual family members for the greater good." The king embraced his brother briefly, a gesture that carried both farewell and reconciliation. Despite everything that had happened, despite the scandal and controversy that had brought them to this point, they remained family members bound by shared history and mutual love, even as public duty required them to make choices that caused personal pain. After Charles departed, Andrew remained alone in the drawing room as shadows lengthened across the grounds outside. The silence that filled Royal Lodge seemed different somehow, charged with the knowledge that his time there was drawing to a close. He began the mental process of saying goodbye to the place that had been his refuge and his fortress, preparing himself for a future that remained uncertain and unwelcome, but ultimately unavoidable. The historic decision had been made, setting in motion a series of events that would reshape not only Andrew's personal circumstances, but also send a clear message about the monarchy's willingness to hold its own members accountable for their actions. The king had chosen duty over family loyalty, a decision that would define his early reign and establish important precedents for how the royal family would handle future controversies. The weeks following the private meeting between King Charles and Prince Andrew moved with the relentless precision of a Swiss timepiece, each day bringing new developments that would reshape the Duke of York's future and send ripples throughout the British establishment. Royal Lodge, once a sanctuary of privilege and privacy, had become the center of intense speculation as rumors of Andrew's impending departure began to circulate through London's elite circles and eventually reached the voracious appetite of the British tabloid press. Princess Beatrice arrived at Royal Lodge on a crisp November morning, her BMW crunching over the gravel driveway that she had traveled countless times throughout her life. The eldest daughter of the Duke of York carried herself with the quiet determination that had sustained her through years of public scrutiny and family crisis. At 35, she had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of royal life while building her own career and family, skills that would prove invaluable in helping her father through this transition. Inside the mansion, she found Andrew in his study, surrounded by boxes and legal documents that represented decades of accumulated life. The room that had once been his command center, filled with naval memorabilia and photographs from his military service, now looked like a staging area for retreat. The contrast was stark and painful, a visual representation of how far he had fallen from the heights of royal privilege. "Father," Beatrice said softly, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss practical matters. Time is becoming short, and there are decisions that cannot be delayed any longer." Andrew looked up from the papers he had been reviewing, his face showing the strain of recent weeks. Sleep had become elusive, and the weight of his circumstances seemed to press down upon him with each passing day. Yet when he looked at his daughter, he managed to summon the strength that parenthood had always provided him, even in his darkest moments. "I've been looking at properties," he replied, gesturing toward a stack of real estate listings that his solicitors had provided. "Nothing quite comparable to this, of course, but suitable accommodations for someone in my position." The phrase carried layers of meaning, acknowledging both his royal heritage and his current disgrace. Beatrice leaned forward to examine some of the listings. The properties ranged from modest country houses to luxury apartments in central London, each representing a significant step down from the grandeur of Royal Lodge. Yet she also recognized that her father's options were limited by both financial constraints and security considerations that would follow him wherever he went. "What about the cottage in Windsor Great Park?" she suggested, referring to a property that had been offered by the Crown Estate as a potential alternative. "It's smaller, obviously, but it would allow you to maintain some connection to the royal estate, and the security arrangements would be more manageable." The cottage in question was a 4-bedroom property that had once housed senior estate workers. While comfortable and well-appointed, it represented a dramatic reduction in both space and status from Royal Lodge. For a man who had grown accustomed to 30 rooms and extensive grounds, the adjustment would be significant and constant reminder of his changed circumstances. "I've considered it," Andrew replied carefully, "but I worry about the optics of accepting charity from the Crown Estate when the same organization is forcing me from my current home. It might be seen as accepting a consolation prize, which could undermine whatever dignity I'm trying to maintain through this process." Beatrice understood her father's concern, but she also recognized the practical realities of his situation. His options were limited, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The media attention surrounding his departure from Royal Lodge would be intense regardless of where he went, and finding secure, appropriate accommodations within his budget would be challenging. "Princess Eugenie has been researching properties as well," Beatrice continued, referring to her younger sister who had been equally supportive throughout this crisis. "She found several possibilities in Hampshire and Surrey, far enough from London to provide some privacy, but close enough for family visits and necessary travel." The mention of his younger daughter brought a slight smile to Andrew's face. Both of his daughters had stood by him throughout the scandal, providing emotional support and practical assistance even as they navigated their own careers and families. Their loyalty had been one of the few bright spots in an otherwise devastating period of his life. Meanwhile, across London, the machinery of royal communications was working overtime to manage the inevitable media storm that would accompany Andrew's departure. The King's press secretary, along with senior advisors from both Buckingham Palace and Clarence House, met daily to refine the messaging strategy that would present this decision in the most favorable light possible for the monarchy. "The key is to emphasize that this is the Duke's decision," explained the communications director during one such meeting. "We want to avoid any narrative that suggests family conflict or forced exile. Instead, we present this as a mature, responsible choice made by someone who recognizes the need to step back further from public life." The challenge lay in making this narrative believable to a skeptical press and public that had followed Andrew's decline with fascination and often undisguised satisfaction. The tabloids, in particular, would be eager to portray this as the final humiliation of a disgraced prince, and managing their coverage would require careful orchestration and strategic leaks of information. "What about the timing of the announcement?" asked Sir Clive Alderton, who had been coordinating between the various royal households involved in this delicate operation. We need to balance the need for sufficient notice with the desire to minimize speculation and rumor-mongering. The group discussed various options, from a formal statement released through the official royal channels to a more informal leak that would allow the story to emerge gradually through trusted journalists. Each approach carried risks and benefits, and the final decision would need approval from the king himself. Back at Royal Lodge, Andrew was grappling with more personal challenges as he began the emotional process of selecting which possessions to take with him to his new, smaller home. The mansion was filled with objects that chronicled his entire adult life. Naval awards and commendations, photographs from official engagements, gifts from foreign dignitaries, and personal mementos from family celebrations and holidays. The practical limitations of his new accommodations meant that most of these items would need to be stored or, in some cases, returned to the royal collection. Each decision felt like another small loss, another step away from the identity he had constructed over decades of royal service and privilege. His long-serving butler, Jenkins, had been with him for nearly 15 years and understood the significance of every object in the house. The elderly man moved through the rooms with quiet efficiency, carefully cataloging items and ensuring that the most precious and personal belongings were properly protected for the move. Perhaps we should prioritize the family photographs and personal correspondence, Jenkins suggested diplomatically. The official items can be dealt with through appropriate channels, but your personal memories should remain with you regardless of circumstances. Andrew nodded gratefully, appreciating not only the practical advice, but also the dignity with which his staff continued to treat him despite the circumstances. Many of them would not be able to follow him to his new residence due to space and financial limitations, representing yet another loss in an already difficult transition. The Duke spent considerable time in his private office, reviewing financial documents and legal papers with his solicitors and accountants. The termination of his lease on Royal Lodge would eliminate significant monthly expenses, but it would also require substantial costs for moving, establishing security at a new residence, and potentially paying penalties or early termination fees on various contracts and agreements. His lawyers had been negotiating with the Crown Estate to minimize the financial impact of his departure while ensuring that the transition proceeded smoothly. The royal family was eager to avoid any legal challenges that might prolong the situation or create additional negative publicity, so they have been relatively accommodating regarding practical matters. The security assessment for the Hampshire property has been completed, his chief legal advisor informed him during one of their regular meetings. The cost will be significantly lower than current arrangements, but still substantial given the ongoing threat assessment. The Home Office has indicated they will maintain necessary protection, though at a reduced level. The reduction in security represented another symbolic diminishment of his status. While Prince Andrew would continue to receive protection befitting his position in the line of succession, he would no longer enjoy the comprehensive security blanket that surrounded senior working royals. The change would be noticeable and constant reminder of his altered circumstances. As November progressed toward December, the pace of preparations accelerated. Professional moving companies began discreet assessments of the logistics involved in relocating a royal household, while Andrew's staff worked to coordinate the complex arrangements required for such a sensitive operation. Every detail needed to be planned carefully to minimize media attention and ensure the security of both the departing Duke and his possessions. The emotional toll of these preparations was evident in Andrew's increasingly haggard appearance, and the way he seemed to linger in each room of Royal Lodge as if trying to memorize every detail. The house had been more than just his residence. It had been his refuge during the worst moments of the scandal, the place where he could retreat from public scrutiny and maintain some semblance of normal family life. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie visited regularly during these final weeks, providing practical assistance and emotional support while also helping their father begin to envision a future beyond Royal Lodge. They organized family dinners and informal gatherings, creating new memories that might help ease the pain of leaving behind so many old ones. This isn't the end of everything, Eugenie reminded her father during one such visit. It's a new chapter, and while it's not the one we would have chosen, it can still be meaningful if we approach it with the right attitude. Her words reflected the pragmatic optimism that had sustained the family through years of crisis. But Andrew struggled to share her hopeful perspective. At 63 years old, he felt too old to reinvent himself and too scarred by scandal to believe that genuine rehabilitation was possible. The future stretched ahead of him like an unknown country, full of challenges and uncertainties he was not sure he was equipped to handle. The announcement of his departure from Royal Lodge was now just weeks away, and with it would come a new phase of public scrutiny and media attention. The Duke of York was about to discover whether the British public's capacity for forgiveness matched their appetite for royal scandal, and whether a disgraced prince could find a way to live with dignity in a world that seemed determined to remember only his failures. The first week of December brought an unexpected early snowfall to the Windsor estate, transforming Royal Lodge into a winter wonderland that seemed almost magical in the pale morning light. Prince Andrew stood at his bedroom window, watching the snow settle on the gardens he had tended and enjoyed for more than 2 decades. The pristine white landscape felt like nature's way of providing a clean slate, though he knew that his own fresh start would be far more complicated and considerably less beautiful. The official announcement of his departure had been released 3 days earlier through carefully coordinated statements from Buckingham Palace and Andrew's own representatives. The messaging had been crafted to present the decision as voluntary and forward-looking, emphasizing the Duke's desire to reduce the burden on the royal family and focus on private life. The media response had been predictably intense, with headlines ranging from sympathetic to savage, but Andrew had forced himself to avoid reading the coverage. Moving trucks arrived at Royal Lodge before dawn, their drivers sworn to confidentiality and accompanied by royal protection officers who ensured that no unauthorized photographs could be taken of the operation. The logistics of relocating a royal household were staggering in their complexity, involving everything from priceless antiques to classified security equipment. Each box, each piece of furniture, each personal belonging had to be carefully cataloged and transported according to strict protocols. Andrew's new home was a Tudor-style house in Hampshire, set on 5 acres of private grounds that provided both security and privacy. While comfortable and elegant, it represented perhaps 1/10 the space of Royal Lodge and required him to make difficult choices about which possessions to keep and which to place in storage. The house had been purchased through a trust arrangement that obscured his direct ownership, protecting him from some media scrutiny while ensuring his ongoing financial obligations remained manageable. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie had both taken leave from their professional commitments to help coordinate the move and provide emotional support during this traumatic transition. They worked alongside Andrew's reduced household staff to ensure that essential items were properly packed and that the new house would be ready for occupancy. Their presence provided comfort and continuity during a period when everything else in his life seemed to be changing. The study in the new house has excellent light, Beatrice told her father as they supervised the careful packing of his naval memorabilia. And there's a perfect spot for grandfather's desk where you can continue your writing project. She was referring to Andrew's long-planned memoir, a project that had taken on new urgency and complexity given recent events. The memoir represented both opportunity and danger for the Duke of York. While it could provide him with a platform to tell his own story and perhaps rehabilitate his reputation, it also risked reopening old wounds and subjecting him to renewed criticism. His publishers have been encouraging but realistic about the challenges involved in marketing a book by such a controversial figure. "I've been thinking about the tone and approach," Andrew replied, carefully wrapping a framed photograph of his naval service. Perhaps focusing on the lessons learned rather than trying to justify past decisions. The public might be more receptive to reflection and humility than to defensiveness and justification. His daughters exchanged a meaningful look, recognizing that their father was beginning to accept responsibility for his situation in a way that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of the scandal. This acknowledgement of fault and willingness to learn from mistakes represented significant personal growth, even if it had come at an enormous cost. Meanwhile, across the royal family, the implications of Andrew's departure were being felt in ways both practical and symbolic. King Charles had demonstrated his willingness to take decisive action when family loyalty conflicted with institutional needs, establishing a precedent that would influence how future controversies might be handled. The monarch's approval ratings had actually increased following the announcement, suggesting that the public appreciated his firm leadership during a difficult situation. Prince William, as heir to the throne, had been closely involved in discussions about Andrew's future throughout the process. The Prince of Wales understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to adapt to changing social expectations and maintain public trust. Andrew's exile from Royal Lodge sent a clear message that no member of the royal family was above accountability for their actions. "This decision will be remembered as a turning point," William told his father during one of their regular private meetings. "It shows that we're willing to put principle above privilege, even when it involves painful personal sacrifices." The prince's words reflected a new generation's understanding of royal duty, one that prioritized public service over personal comfort. The emotional cost of the decision was not lost on Charles, who continued to struggle with the balance between his roles as king and brother. He had spoken with Andrew several times since their formal meeting, offering both practical support and personal reassurance that his love for his brother remained unchanged despite the circumstances that had forced this separation. Back in Hampshire, Andrew was beginning the slow process of adapting to his new reality. The house felt eerily quiet after the constant activity of Royal Lodge, with its reduced staff and fewer visitors creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and lonely. He spent his days unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and trying to create a sense of home in surroundings that felt foreign and temporary. The security arrangements at the new property were less intrusive than those at Royal Lodge, reflecting his reduced public profile, but also leaving him feeling more vulnerable and exposed. The protective officers assigned to him were professional and discreet, but their presence served as a constant reminder of both his royal status and the ongoing threats that status entailed. His first week in a new house was marked by a series of small discoveries and adjustments. The kitchen was modern and well-equipped but required learning new appliances and layouts. The garden, while beautiful, lacked the extensive grounds and mature landscaping that had made Royal Lodge so special. Even simple tasks like finding his way around the house in the dark required conscious thought and adjustment. The local community's reaction to their new royal neighbor had been mixed but generally respectful. While some residents were clearly excited by the proximity to a member of the royal family, others seemed to view his presence with suspicion or resentment. Andrew made a conscious decision to keep a low profile during his first weeks in residence, avoiding local establishments and public appearances that might create uncomfortable situations. His daughters visited regularly, often staying overnight and helping him establish routines and domestic arrangements. Their presence brought life and warmth to the house, creating temporary moments of normalcy that helped offset the profound changes he was experiencing. Family dinners in the new dining room gradually began to feel less like exile and more like a different kind of home. "The house is starting to feel like yours," Princess Eugenie observed during one such visit, noting how Andrew had arranged his books and personal photographs to create familiar spaces within unfamiliar surroundings. "And I think the change might be good for you in ways you haven't fully realized yet." Her comment reflected a growing sense that this forced transition might ultimately prove beneficial, removing Andrew from the isolation and introspection that had characterized his final years at Royal Lodge. The new house required him to be more engaged with practical matters and daily life, potentially providing the structure and purpose that had been missing during his period of enforced retirement from public duties. The financial implications of the move were significant, but manageable thanks to careful planning and family support. Andrew's reduced living expenses would stretch his available resources considerably further, though he would need to adjust to a lifestyle that was comfortable rather than luxurious. The symbolic importance of this adjustment was not lost on him. It represented a return to more realistic expectations and a rejection of the entitled mindset that had contributed to his downfall. As Christmas approached, Andrew faced the prospect of celebrating the holiday season in his new home for the first time. The traditions and memories associated with Royal Lodge would need to be recreated or replaced, representing both loss and opportunity for new beginnings. His daughters had already begun planning a family celebration that would help establish positive associations with the new house. "This Christmas will be different," Beatrice acknowledged during one of their planning conversations. But different doesn't necessarily mean worse. We have the opportunity to create new traditions that reflect who we are now rather than who we used to be. The wisdom in her words reflected the pragmatic optimism that had sustained the family through years of crisis. While Andrew's departure from Royal Lodge marked the end of an era, it also represented the possibility of redemption and renewal if he could find the strength and wisdom to embrace the opportunities that change might bring. The Duke of York's exile from the royal estate had been completed with dignity and efficiency, sending a clear message about the modern monarchy's commitment to accountability while preserving the personal relationships that would sustain the family through future challenges. King Charles had demonstrated that love and duty could coexist even when they demanded painful choices, establishing his reign on principles that prioritized public service over personal comfort. As snow continued to fall on both Royal Lodge and Andrew's new home, it seemed to symbolize the fresh start that this historic decision had made possible. The prince who had once lived in luxury at the heart of the royal estate now faced an uncertain but potentially redemptive future in the English countryside, where he would have the opportunity to discover whether genuine rehabilitation was possible for someone who had fallen so far from grace. The final chapter of his story remained unwritten, full of possibility for both failure and redemption, dependent entirely on the choices he would make in the years to come.